I've been reading Quit Like a Woman, interesting book on recovery by Holly Whitaker. Um, very, um, what do how do I want to put it? Well, I mean, it's just, I can't sum it up in just a couple words, but it's a book I think really worth looking at, particularly for people not my age. My niece, who's in her early 40s, um, is a big. I told her I was on a panel with this woman, Holly Whitaker, last week, and I told my niece because she recently stopped drinking, and I was like, "Do you know this book? Do you know this woman?" Oh yeah, I love her like that. And it's not AA. It's kind of it is like critiquing AA and 12 step, particularly from the sort of patriarchal part of it. Um, but really very sincere about recovery and sort of just a different kind of approach that I think can be really helpful for people who struggle with or don't who are turned off by AA and and particularly the sort of old white men part of AA. So which here I am. I can't help it. I don't deny it, but I don't approve of myself. I just want you to know that. So I was actually, I was playing golf yesterday, and it's just such an interesting little world, And I was playing in this golf course, a municipal course where it's not a white golf course. It's like a relatively diverse, but I was playing with three other old white men, one of whom I know was a Trump supporter, and one of whom was like an unrepentant hippie, and one of whom was a Croatian immigrant. And on the 13th tee, we started talking about racism. And the hippie and I were talking about how Oregon was founded on racist principles that, you know, something I've just learned, right? New information typically. Uh, this hidden history that, well, hidden from, you know, the mainstream white world. That the original Constitution of Oregon didn't allow Black people to be in the state at all. That solved the whole problem. And we're kind of just throwing these things around, and the Trump guy is going, "Wow, they didn't teach us this stuff. I wish they would have taught us this stuff in our history classes when I was growing up." And I could see that he was sincere. It was like he really didn't know any more than any of us knew, or many of us certainly didn't know these things. Those who didn't probe, and it was just very striking to me that that here we are on a golf course talking about racism. It's like that's the world we're in right now, and that's a big change from not very long ago. And that a guy who I know voted for Trump was like really engaging in the conversation and interested in the conversation. He wasn't shutting it off at all. So those kind of moments give me hope in a strange way, that but the main thing is to realize that these old people like us won't be around that much longer. So hopefully the next generation will be smarter and more informed and yeah, it is a long arc of history. uh oh, okay. I've just Susan, do you want to post that about the Wicked Soba meeting? I've been invited to speak at a meeting in Florida. It's on Saturday, right? And if you want to put it into for everybody to see, uh,
Okay,
yeah, I'm going to speak there this coming Saturday. I think it's 2:30 West Coast time, like 5:30 in Florida. Yeah.
correct.
Yeah, if you
Yes, thank you.
get information,
I,
people might want to come to the meeting. When I speak at an AA meeting, I don't speak as a I don't speak as a Buddhist teacher. I speak as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and so then I just tell my story. And some people care, if you care. But if you need a meeting, um, yeah. All right. So let's begin with some sitting. I'm going to mute everybody now, except myself. So we come again to this moment of entry, of beginning. And it gives us a moment really to see what's going on. You know, we go through our days just kind of moving from one activity to the next. And if we never interrupt that with intentional mindfulness, we can miss the fact that our minds are rushing on and that our bodies are feeling stressed and on edge. That there's this kind of momentum that's just carrying us along unconsciously. So I like this moment of transition from activity into meditation because it interrupts that momentum, and it also shows me the power of that momentum, the energy in my body. That's how I perceive it. That's how I characterize it. It probably could be described in other ways, but it feels very physical. Even sometimes the thought stream feels like it's flowing with the body. So in our meditation practice, we need to find ways to make this transition, to interrupt that flow and settle things so that we aren't just sitting down and closing our eyes and continuing in that stream. So it's helpful to have some form, some intentional practices to get yourself started in a period of meditation. And what I like to do, what I think is helpful, is to address that physical kind of excitement or activation by intentionally calming the body. So this is not a mystery how we do this, that we relax, that we breathe, maybe breathe a little more deeply, that we release tension with our exhalation. You can do something a little more subtle by directing the attention through the body to particular points of tension and activation, like relaxing the jaw, the eyes, the shoulders, softening the belly, opening the chest. Letting the body be still. That as we hold the body still, that brings into relief the energy in the body. We feel how even as we're sitting still, there's a sense of movement within the body. The Buddha calls this process calming the bodily formation. Calming the bodily formation. So once we have practiced this a little bit, it becomes quite natural. We see how bringing intention to our bodily state is so powerful. And this also highlights how not bringing intention or attention to our bodily state allows us to just run through our day with stress, building, tension, impulse then. Acting on craving, acting on aversion. The interaction of physical tension and stress with mental craving and aversion creates an ongoing process of just unconsciousness, living by impulse, acting out. And once we've done some calming of the bodily formation, you can start to focus the mind more. Start to pay attention to the breath as a concentration object. So now we're moving from using the breath for calming to using the breath for focus. If we pay attention to particular sensations carefully, and the focus develops, grows. We take the attention to the tip of the nose, that particular point. That area of sensation where the breath comes in and out. You could also focus on the belly, the feeling of movement as the belly rises and falls with each breath. Either place allows us to really gather the attention, focus the attention. We do this in a gentle way, not a forced way, not an aggressive way. Can actually find a kind of pleasure in just sitting back and being with this simple experience, this simple natural experience of breathing. We don't look for some particular result to come from doing this. As soon as we do that, as soon as we start to strive for something, we block that natural mindfulness, and the body becomes tense again, the mind agitated. We don't have to make anything happen. We just trust in the process. Inevitably, there will be results. All actions have results. So we engage the process sincerely, fully. Part of this process is understanding that the mind will wander from the breath, that our habitual ways of being will sneak back in. We can't expect these habits, these thinking habits and stress habits to just disappear because we want them to. But here we take a different relationship to them. Don't even necessarily see thoughts as a problem. When we see the thought, when we know we're thinking, we let it go and come back. Try to keep it very simple. Not trying to figure out or analyze or critique our experience. There will be time for that, but not during the meditation. I was going to say a little bit more towards the end of the meditation, but then I decided that I wanted to leave some quiet. So I'll just say now that one of the things that makes it possible to sit in a comfortable way, and I mean mentally comfortable way, is taking an attitude of kindness towards ourselves as we're meditating, kind of acceptance of the fact that the mind wanders. There's a, depending on personalities, there can be a tendency to, strive to meditate right, and then when the mind is wandering a lot, to be frustrated with ourselves or to judge ourselves or think we're doing it wrong, and if you pay attention to that experience, it becomes apparent quickly that that's not helping, that's actually making it worse. And so this idea of just sort of understanding, you don't have to do it out of like being overly nice. It's just understanding that this is what the mind does, and if using the step analogy, that we're powerless over our minds to some extent. In the same way that we're powerless over alcohol doesn't mean that we have to drink. We're powerless over our minds doesn't mean we have to get completely lost in it. We don't have to give up. So this then is kind of the question of effort, which is what Vimalasara and I are kind of addressing in this course. And maybe Angela, you could find a link for that and stick it in the chat for people. But it's always the question, like, how do I don't want to just sit here and space out and say that I'm meditating, but I see that when I'm like trying to get it right, that doesn't really work either. And so this subtlety, I actually had a note, this is not the topic of the class today, but we have time. This is Joseph Goldstein from his book Mindfulness, which is a great book. Probably the most thorough and readable book on mindfulness and Buddhist meditation that you'll find. And this is him talking about right effort. And after he goes through kind of these somewhat technical ways of working with wandering mind and kind of, really addressing all these tools. But he finally says, all these teachings remind us that meditation is an art. On this step of the path, right effort, it's not a question of simply following any one technique or thinking there is only one correct approach. Rather, we understand the mind as a vital, vibrant, ever-changing interplay of different mental qualities. If we have a strong commitment to awakening, then we investigate, experiment, and test different ways of abandoning that which is unskillful. That's the key phrase there. We investigate, experiment, and test different ways of abandoning that which is unskillful. The Buddha was the ultimate pragmatist. The teachings are not about dogma, but about skillful means, about understanding what works. And what works can be different for each person, and it can be different from one sitting to another. And so that's why experimenting and testing different methods and sort of, you listen to different teachers and you try the things they offer. You read different books, you try things, and you start to find your own way of meditating. And this is why I say that you are your own meditation teacher ultimately. And I think this applies very much to recovery as well. If you just try to follow the rules and do it just like Bill Wilson did it or something, or Joe and Charlie or somebody, some random sponsor, at a certain point, it's not going to fit you. It's going to be trying to wear somebody else's clothes. and you have to make a program that works for you. And yet it also needs to be committed. And so there's that, always that balance between, oh, I'll just do it my way. I'll just meditate the way I feel like it, and having some discipline and and honesty about what's really working, rather than just sort of doing what pleases you. You know, people who want to, like, okay, you know, I remember one time I was teaching at this treatment center, and somebody was like, well, why don't you use like whale sounds when you're teaching meditation? And I was like, you know, that's good. Whale sounds are nice, but, you know, if I was talking about being mindful of this, my daughter was very young at that time. I was like, if my daughter is, we have to get her off to preschool and she's on the floor having a temper tantrum, I can't like turn on the whale sounds to like get myself mindful. You know, I've got to be there and deal with this and be mindful in that moment, and how to respond to each moment. Uh, so whale sounds. So it's, so okay. So we're in step 4. For those who are just joining us, we've been working through my book, One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps. So I always like to, the cover, and this is the new cover. The old cover was better, but you know, things, if you let a publisher, you know, get hold of your book, they'll make it worse. Bless them. So this is a nice cover. I don't know. Never mind. Okay, step 4. Get it together. I mean, I'm just in my couch, you know, what do you want from me? It's sometimes, you know, it's hard to, I'm at work, get to work. So step 4, this section is called Why Is It So Hard? And I think that that's kind of a question that answers itself. Why is step 4 so hard? And it's pretty self-evident that it's really hard to look at ourselves in this honest way. Step 4 says we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And certainly nobody wants to do that. So this section of the book, as in many others, I kind of use a personal story, which I will not read, but you're welcome to. And it's from, this particular story is from right before I got sober, like about 6, it starts about 6 months before I got sober, and sort of being challenged by the woman I was living with at that time, kind of about taking more responsibility for who I was, and you know, and just seeing all the resistance I had to that, and you know, I've talked about this before, about how I hope that these stories in my book are seen as typical examples, not as being about Kevin, but about how we all, particularly before we get sober, and certainly, you know, I've still been defensive after I got sober. Still am defensive today about being criticized, but how unwilling I was, and I will say how unwilling we tend to be to look at our stuff before we get sober. And that's why I think of step 1 as being kind of the first inventory. You know, that's just the inventory of the fact that we were an addict. And then, of course, we're asked to do a lot more later on. This then kind of digresses, as a lot of these pieces in my book tend to do. Fortunately, I bring it back to the topic, but in the middle, I kind of digress to talking about something else, which I think is worth talking about, which is essentially a kind of spiritual bypass. And again, for people who know this story, who have read the book or followed me for a while, you know, there was a time before I got sober when I got involved with a kind of new age spiritual teacher. And it was kind of a culty situation, but he was homeless, and so it wasn't a very successful cult. but it was that in the sense of just, he kind of walks into my life and says, "Oh yeah, I'm going to get you enlightened. Just follow me." And I was like, "Okay, good. I'll just quit my job, leave my band, leave my apartment, just put my guitar in a backpack and hitchhike across the country with this guy. Oh, that's a good idea. Really good life choices." And um, and this came after. I think it's important to put it in the framework of where my life was, which is that this was the year after I had spent 4 months on intensive meditation retreats the year before, when that was supposed to fix me. And when that didn't fix me, this homeless guy who told me to live on faith and that would, that was going to fix me. So really, that pretty diluted. I hope none of you have gone that far in your delusion, but many of us, whether it's spiritual delusion or a relationship delusion or work delusion, as addicts, we tend to go to these kind of extremes of trying to solve our lives using the wrong tools. And so in this case, we call this spiritual bypass, where we're trying to use a spiritual practice to fix things that really are much beyond the spiritual realm. I had life and living problems. Um, so I'll read a little bit of this section. And this is after just kind of describing, the dysfunctional relationship with this woman and the cheating on her and all that good stuff. That I could live this way, unfaithful to my partner, binging on drugs and alcohol, denying responsibility for my actions, was partly a result of my time with Ananda, as he called himself. Still don't know what his real name was. His teaching was that I was already enlightened and that any action could be performed from an enlightened viewpoint. I took this idea and distorted it to justify anything and everything I did. Stoned and half drunk, I would convince myself that I was mindfully walking through the bar. Flirting with women, I would tell myself that it was all a game, that I wasn't creating any negative karma because my intention was pure, which was, in fact, pure bullshit. My intention was to get laid. The true higher teachings assume that the student has gone through rigorous moral training and is certainly following the fundamental precepts of non-harming. To pretend that you are enlightened and that you can do no harm when you are in fact still driven by greed, hatred, and especially delusion is a dangerous perversion of the teachings. It's this kind of thinking that supports cult leaders, adulterous gurus, drunken Zen masters, and child-abusing priests. It is at root a deeply cynical behavior. Only the cynicism itself is hidden as well, along with the true motivation for the destructive actions. So, as I say, that's a little bit of a digression from this idea of inventory, but it's still, getting to part of that inventory. Then I get back on this topic again. The title of this section is "Why Is It So Hard?" The fear of facing my own failures with Margaret was the same fear I faced when approaching the fourth step, fear of ego destruction. Any admission of weakness or flaws can trigger this fear. I felt that Margaret was threatening who I was, my very existence, and that if she were right, it would invalidate me as a person. I thought that if I let in her ideas about me, I would be admitting to being a failure as a person, to being irrevocably damaged, to being small and cruel and stupid. So I fought. We fought. I blocked her attempts to talk with me, to explore our relationship and my part in its problems. When I did get sober the following summer, my ego was finally able to take at least the first step toward deflation. Another year later, as I began step 4, I was ready for more. Once there at step 4, I began to see how liberating these deflations were. Once I realized how admitting I was wrong about something could free me from so much pain, confusion, fear, and stress, I broke through. This is surely one of the stages of spiritual awakening that step 12 promises. In Buddhist terms, it's seeing the transparency of ego, realizing that actions don't define us, that thoughts are empty, that there's nothing to hold on to, nothing worth fighting over. So I kind of saved the day there for that. Reading that part scares me a little bit, but when I get to the end, I feel better. Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting place where Buddhism and the 12 steps kind of blend in an interesting way. How our attachment to self, our attachment to ego, a better word for it, our attachment to self-image, how that blocks us from this very freeing process of inventory. And that then when we sort of use a Buddhist lens for this, that we can see, right, like self is a construction. And it's a construction of thoughts or memories. But a lot of it is, a lot of what we call ego is belief. It's a belief that we are something, and that needs to be protected. And so the steps really tear that down. And Buddhism is meant to tear that down too, but the steps, as they often do, kind of go right at things. Sometimes Buddhism sort of is holding things in this bigger space, and you can kind of study it and it's interesting, but in terms of just your own stuff, writing, searching in fearless moral inventory, we don't get that so much in Dharma practice. You can, if you have if you have a relationship with the teacher and you're really sincere about it, but in any case, not meant to be a critique of Buddhism, but that this is again why I think combining the steps with Buddhism is so helpful, because this is, a way to really deconstruct ego and get free of what are, very, the obstructions, the real obstructions to true freedom. And I'll note that, that this section of the book is framed around this relationship, with this woman I call Margaret. It's not her real name. And that I think probably intuitively one of the reasons I framed it around that is that this kind of work, this kind of letting go around ego is so important in relationships. No intimate relationship can really survive for a long time without a willingness to let go of your defenses, and without that willingness to listen and to be open and take in criticism. That's just sort of inevitable in intimate relationships. And finally, I'll say that, like, ultimately this is a personal statement, but I imagine it's true for many people. A lot of my work in my program has been around relationship, and certainly the first years, probably the first 10 years, that was primary. Anyway, that's enough from me to get us leave a little bit of time for people to comment or make questions or say whatever you like. I'm open for.
Hi, Kevin, it's John.
Hi, John.
When you were reading that passage of the before and after the pseudo ego death with Anand and the ego death with the fourth step and the Buddhist practice, it just struck me how similar they are and how deceptively similar they are. And I guess for me, I don't know if I was just on a spiritual path and I wasn't an alcoholic, I don't know if I would have been awake to that, because for me, what woke me up was the unmanageability.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that would have happened to me if I hadn't had alcohol in my life.
Yeah.
So, but it just struck me that how closely they are to each. If you describe them, it's almost, and you're inside the experience of the pseudo ego death, the
Yeah.
pseudo enlightenment. You're doing stuff, but your experience of it is the same.
Yeah. Yes, that's a really interesting point, John. It kind of reminds me of, if you're familiar with the term, the near enemies. And so, right, with something like they say, the near enemy of equanimity is apathy. So then it's kind of like the near enemy of ego death is, what is it? Ego delusion. I mean, yeah. So how do we distinguish them? It's a good question. I, this is where, in the first thing that comes to mind is the Buddha's recommendation that we have noble friends and noble conversation, that, and in, like, if I had, at the time with Ananda, if I had like called or trusted, people who really knew me, like my family and my close friends, I think they would have suggested I not do that, but I didn't trust them, and I didn't. I was. It's delusion it's really hard to break out of delusion. Let's just put it that way. It's probably the hardest thing to break out of. Craving and desire and aversion, greed and hatred. It's easier to break out of them because they have obvious kind of problem. But delusion, you're just off base anyway. So, Shambo, got your hand up.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question of that continuing ego deconstruction. And this may be kind of a strange question, but I have this fierce sense that I can do it myself.
Right.
And I always want to know the distinction between practice, and practicing letting go of those ego delusions, and like I don't know, getting had, Yep. Like, do I just give myself away and get had? Or how am I sticking to my work and being genuine to Dharma practice? Or do I just get had and get, kind of run over? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what you mean by getting had. Can you give a sort of an example to make it more specific for me?
When getting into an argument with someone and, they're just protecting themselves and you just kind of let yourself go, like, okay, fine.
Uh-huh.
That sort of thing.
Well,
instead of real Dharma work happening.
Okay. But I mean, if you're in an argument with someone, another question you ask is it worth the energy to be right? To be right? Uh-huh. How important is it to be right?
And that goes through my head quite a bit.
Right. Yeah. And so just like, and this again is very helpful in relationships. Like, how important is it for me to be right? Yeah. And so then you're talking more about, what is my intention? What is that I really want in the long term? Do I want harmony and peace, or do I want to wind up as number one?
Right. Or do I support someone else's delusion by just not being right?
Yeah.
And who am I to say someone's deluded?
Well, there is that, but certainly, whether you support or don't support someone else's delusion, um, you might not have the power to uh, burst their bubble of delusion. But this is again about skillful means. Like, what's a skillful way to talk to this person? You know,
Yeah.
um, like, my friend, I will say, my friend that I only know him from the golf course, but who's a Trump supporter. He at one time said Elizabeth Warren is crazy, and I thought, okay, he's been watching Fox News, and I didn't think there was much point in, you know, arguing with him about that. But then on the tee box yesterday, there was a way in which, like, the conversation went so that I knew that he was going to hear this, like, oh, the history of Oregon, like, that's very different from like the opinion about an individual. Oh, then he could hear that and kind of go, wow, that's really interesting. And I could see that his mind was willing to open up around that. So it's that skillfulness of trying to find the way, what's the way in to talk to people, rather than always going straight at them. That, like the intervention model versus the attraction rather than promotion model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dana. Hi.
Hi, I'm nervous.
You're nervous.
Yes.
Hey, you're among friends.
Thank
At
you.
least I consider you a friend. I don't know.
Thank you. So I've had identity issues my entire life. This question of who am I, from as early as I can remember, just being conscious that I was a self, so to speak. And I've got attachment issues, buried in unhealthy relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, what's beyond this ego death? I mean, what is that? Is that what's referred to as the true self, the higher self? I guess that's my question. Just if I don't even, and I do know I have an ego, and I know that, my defenses have gotten me to where I am and have helped me to overcome a whole lot. But I also know that's also this self-destructive part of me too. So I'm definitely ready to deconstruct it and see what's underneath. But what is underneath or beyond that? Is that what's referred to as, not to use overused terms, but, that true self or higher self?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dana. That's a really good question, and there's a lot in there. So I'm going to kind of start with the last part, which is I have a lot of trouble with the idea of a true self or a higher self, because it's still a self, and that whether the Buddha doesn't say there's a true self or a higher self, and he also doesn't say that there is no self. He just says that thoughts aren't self, feelings aren't self, memories aren't self, body isn't self. He just points to all the things that aren't self. So what it seems to me that he's kind of saying ultimately, like, that's not the issue, whether there's a self or there's not a self. Don't worry about that. Take care of what you can address, which is our thoughts and feelings and how we create suffering and how we end suffering. I mean, that's what the Buddha is interested in. That's what I'm interested in, right? I don't really care about theology or philosophy. I care about this experience of being a human being and how to kind of solve the problem of suffering. But I want to come back then to what you were just sort of talking about yourself, and in terms of struggling around identity, and to just say that deconstructing ego, and as they talk about in the steps a lot, humility and all that, that has a really important place when we are blocking any true self-examination, and when we're blocking taking responsibility. But it that even this idea of deconstructing ego can be unhelpful if there's if we have a really low self-esteem, if we have a low negative ideas about ourselves, if we don't love ourselves in some way, if there isn't some, the phrase that applies to this is, you can't get rid of your ego until you have an ego. And really what that's saying is that until you have a healthy, integrated sense of self, a kind of sense of who you are, which doesn't mean you have it all figured out, but that, you're kind of functioning well in the world, and that things tend to your relationships and your kind of place in the world sort of makes sense. And I know for me, when I was involved with Ananda, I didn't have that. I hadn't really integrated my personality. I had this like spiritual thing going, but I wasn't dealing with these basic issues around that are about addiction, but underlying that is this longing and this emptiness and this oh God, this unfulfilled need that was, it kind of feels like I need love, but it's something, it's not quite that romantic. It's more that boy, it's so hard to describe it. And I think about what happened in my early years of recovery, and like the first 5 years particularly, it was kind of going, I need to be more real, and and being honest about my failings wasn't about tearing myself down. So that's why the term deconstructing is a little risky, right? Because it sounds like you're tearing yourself down, and I don't mean it like that at all. It's that I'm really looking at I'm looking at the parts of me that really aren't serving me, that are there, that are there out of fear, that I'm acting out of fear. I'm afraid to be imperfect. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just stumbling around with this, but it's hard to get to. But, this is how I really think I see it, that I felt like I needed to be perfect in order to be okay. And if there was any chink in that armor, that was dangerous, because it meant I'm not okay because I'm not perfect. Right? And so this is kind of the paradox of recovery. By admitting that I wasn't perfect, by realizing that it's okay to not be perfect, then that's what I'm getting at with all of this, with the inventory, with the idea of deconstructing ego. What I'm really talking about isn't deconstructing ego, it's deconstructing this wall of fear around myself, this need to protect myself, this need to be perfect, and to understand that once I can realize that I don't need to be perfect, that's so freeing. And then I can just be myself, whatever that is in any given moment, which keeps changing. I'm a different person on the golf course than I am sitting here in front of you guys. And that's okay. That I don't have to have like this identity that's like really, solid and safe. Don't worry. I got an email about 5 years ago that was unsigned, but it was clearly from someone I'd been in a relationship with a long time ago, and who was an alcoholic, and she had found me on the internet, and it was clear from the email that she was still drinking, although I had heard that at one time that she had stopped drinking. And it was a threatening email in which she said, if people find out how you treated me, you're going to be, your thing's going to be blown. And I was like, you know what? You're in here. What I did is in here. So I don't, nobody's going to be like, oh my God, he did that. It's like, I mean, yeah, I don't like people to know the particulars of the awful things that I did in my life any more than anybody does. But I think that you guys kind of know, like, Kevin's not perfect, and he did some bad shit because he was an alcoholic. And like, I did some bad shit because I was an alcoholic. And so we're not going to hold it against him. Hopefully you're not. So that to me is a lot of it, is that just like we can be, accepting our humanness. Thank you there, Deb. Perfectly imperfect. Well, Leslie, can you wait for next time? We're kind of over our schedule, and I don't like to hold people. But
No problem.
if you have a question that, and if you want to email me, you're always welcome to do that as well. And I'm happy to respond there, or come on Friday or next Tuesday and ask again. Okay. All right, you guys, you got me all worked up. Thanks. We'll be back here Friday. And then, as I said, Mondays, the next 2 Mondays, I'm with Vimala Sara with Inside LA. And that's on their Inside LA website. Great. So, and Angela has put in a bunch of great information. Thank you for how to offer Dana, my Facebook page, my website, and then some of the coming events. So if you want to save the chat where it has all these links and all these comments, you click on the 3-dot menu at the bottom, at the chat, where you enter a chat, and it says save chat. And you can save that for yourself, and you can just have a file. It'll save, and I think it saves into a Zoom folder. So that's all I know. All right, you guys, take care. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, Abigail.
Thank you.